I want to say three things before I finish the power, close the power section of the module. First is that the cross-subsidy surcharge that I showed, I mean, we need to clarify that mostly it's faced by industry, not consumers, because they are the people who are actually going to the power exchange, because only those greater than 1 megawatt can access the power exchange, and these are usually typically industrial consumers. The second thing I want to say on this is that all the noise that you heard was actually a power cut in the other room, and I think we were spared the power cut, but those people in the other room were not. The third thing I want to say is that, which I forgot to mention, is that when I first came up to do this job, I remember reading an article about a textile entrepreneur in Tamil Nadu. Tamil Nadu has a textile cluster in Tirupur, and then we invited him to come, and this was, in the context of, Make in India had just started. So we asked him to come and tell us about what he was doing. And the bottom line of his story was that he's a very successful businessman. He wanted to expand his textile operation in India. And then he did not want to expand in Tamil Nadu because of just one problem, the power problem. And guess where he ended up relocating his factory? Jharkhand, Gujarat, Chhattisgarh, the 23 states left. Telangana. The answer is South Carolina in the United States. So the state of power he felt was so inadequate in India that because he had very ambitious plans, it turned out that it was cheaper to relocate it there. No, so that's the point. See, remember, clothing is labor intensive, textile is power intensive. A textile doesn't use that much labor, so textile. And no, but this is despite the fact that his markets, not necessarily in the US, his markets were here, but despite the greater transportation cost, both the quality and the price of power was so much cheaper that he chose to do that. So that is actually my first encounter with the power sector in India. Okay, so now we're going to do railways. This is just a chart showing how the railway network has expanded. Every year, you have a Nobel Prize in economics, but some people say that the most prestigious prize in economics is called the John Bates Clark Award. It's awarded to an economist who's under 40 years of age. They used to award it every 2 years, now they award it every year. And the person who won it this year, Dave Donaldson, he won it in part or in large part because of his research on Indian railways and the history of the Indian railways and the impacts that it had. So basically, he was exploring this period between the first and second chart, not the third chart. And essentially, he shows that what powerful impacts basically transportation connectivity have, and they had in India as well, what role they served in integrating markets in colonial India. Okay, we spoke about this briefly yesterday. I think you raised it. The railways, apart from everything else, has also been used for social engineering purposes. I spoke about the freight equalization scheme that we used to have until very recently. Essentially, the Indian planners wanted to, spread industrial activity in India, and because normally you would try and locate your industrial activity close to the resource, especially steel, you would locate close to coal, but I think the planners wanted to disperse that, and they started a scheme called freight equalization. Basically, the freight cost would be the same regardless of distance, which of course is very against comparative advantage. And basically, this research by this person, Firth, shows that it had a big impact on both when it was created and when it was ended, both times I think it had a big impact on the location of industry. When it was started, you did get, for example, as I mentioned, steel factories in Punjab, and essentially it disfavored the eastern states to begin with, and so they complain a lot about that, and so it was removed, and so now some of that discrimination seems to have been reversed. Now, basic facts about the railways, it's the biggest employer. Just the magnitude of the Indian Railways, what they do is astonishing. 13,000 passenger trains, 9,000 goods trains a day, 8.1 billion passengers. It's amazing, and 11.1 billion tons of freight in 2015-16. Now, again, I always hesitate to read out fact after fact because it gets very boring. And so when we were thinking about how to think about the railways, how do you think about the challenge? We've spoken about the challenges of the power sector. How do you think about the challenge of the railways? And actually, to me, conceptually, the problem came alive by a very insightful remark that, in one of these big meetings that we were having, a very insightful remark that the finance minister, Mr. Arun Jaitley, made. Really kind of conceptually opened my eyes to the heart of the problem for the railways, which is this. I call this the Jaitley-Prabhu Dilemma. So it's a kind of scissors effect. Here you have a huge public sector monopoly that is burdened by social obligations and, historically it's been underfunded, underinvested. That now more and more is having to face private sector competition for its two core businesses. Freight, you see there on the right-hand side, the modal share of, i.e. how much of freight is done by the railways in India and how much it's done in other countries. And you see that ratio it used to be high, and over time it's been declining because of competition from private sector transport players and operators. So that's the first core business, passenger business, the freight business. The other business, of course, is the passenger business. And here, increasingly, at least on the upper end, AC, second class, and so on, first class, the railways is facing competition from airlines. So, for example, New Delhi, Kolkata AC 2-tier fare in Rajdhani is 3,000, economy class 3,500. So in a sense, I think this captures in one slide what the conceptual problem for the railways is going forward. I know, let me again say that I'm sure there are many of you who know more about the railways, more about transport, more about airlines than I do. But I think just as a way of framing what the problem is, I find this a very useful thing. So, and then of course you have to go into why this has happened, what's happening, what the challenges are facing the railways. But this is the kind of scissors, pincers effect that the railways is facing in my view. If you think about a public sector, the point of this slide is a bit like the power tariff slide. Is not for you to read it, it's just to go away just looking at how complex the bureaucratic structure is. I'm told that there are 10, 12 services in the railways. You see on the right hand side, total 10 grade A services in the rail. So there's railway traffic, railway accounts, railway engineering, etc., etc. So it's a really complicated organization to run, and it's not so it's a public sector behemoth like this, that has to compete with basically very nimble private sector people. The airlines are nimble, private sector trucking companies, operators are very nimble, and the railways. So in a sense, it is a kind of impossibly difficult challenge for the railways. On top of that, in the first survey that we did, we had a whole chapter on the railways, essentially because at that time when I first came, one of our big pitches that we made in the first two documents that we wrote was to say that because private investment was weak in the economy, we needed much more public investment. The PPP model was and continues to be in kind of limbo, and so we made a big push for public investment. And then, of course, the question was, where do you invest? And at that time, it seemed to us that the railways, and it still continues to be the case, that the railways offered a very good opportunity to increase public investment. And you can see that over the years, there has been chronic underinvestment in the railways. This is a chart of what the share percentage of total plan that goes to the transport sector and what goes to the railways. You see that consistently railways has been lower and declining over time, whereas for transport, you know, it's even gone up to some extent. So the share of railways only 5.5% versus 11% for the other transport sector. So there's been chronic underinvestment. And if you look at that capacity addition, so these are two comparisons. On the right-hand side, you know, how much capacity has been added in India compared to China. And you see on the left hand, that's a cross-country comparison. And this is a within India comparison. What is the capacity added? Railways and roads. And you see how much underinvestment the railways have faced. The index here is, you know, running track kilometers, RKM. That's how you measure the capacity addition in railways. As a consequence of this underinvestment, there's massive congestion. 60% of sections are operating at greater than 100% capacity. I guess maybe the Omkara clip comes alive in this context. You know, you don't even have, you know, enough capacity going one way. If you gumao the train, I don't know what's going to happen. It will probably, so it's a huge problem. And of course, as a result of this, the last two budgets have seen an increase in capital expenditure. So the money allocated to railways have increased substantially, and the railways have a big plan to expand this. Now, so the three major kind of, you know, challenges for the railways. One, a huge public sector, and of course, public sector with, you know, with very high employment. I mean, compared to this, you know, so that creates its own challenges in terms of what kind of reforms you can do. Second is the chronic underinvestment, and the third, we saw this in power, we see this in the GST, and you see this in the railways as well. I mean, there's pretty massive cross-subsidization going on. So on the left-hand side, you see, you know, the passenger rate index for the railways and CPI. You know, the two diverge, but in terms of freight, wholesale price and freight, basically, I mean, you could argue, if you do some cross-country comparisons, probably freight costs in India would not look very good in any cross-country comparison, because again, we cross-subsidize in order to provide cheap fares to passengers, especially to, you know, unreserved second class and so on. We have to charge more for freight. Another thing, you know, I don't know whether you saw in the middle class subsidy thing that we did, we showed that, you know, even for some of the higher categories in the railways, there is some subsidization going on. We calculate, you know, subsidy in all AC categories 1,000. If you read the economic survey, actually, either of last year or the UBI chapter this year, you will get a more detailed explanation of how we calculated these subsidies. So I mean, so in that sense, imagine if we subsidize even the upper segments. Imagine what the subsidies also are to, you know, the lower segments as well. We know that, you know, if you underprovide for the railways, there's a huge cost. I mean, remember that the part of the reason why we say, you know, we need the railways in India, we need to invest more in the railways, is firstly the multipliers are huge. We calculated that if you take into account the forward and backward linkages, I think it's very huge in the railways. And of course also, you know, the environmental costs of not doing railways and having it done by roads is just enormous. For example, rail transport emits 17 CO2 equivalent. compared to road, it's 84. So it's like a factor of 5. So, so in that sense, by not investing in the railways, we actually not only create complications in economic terms, but also in environmental terms. And also, this is data that we don't have here, but if you look at road accidents as well, for example, you will find similar statistics that chronic underinvestment, because the number of road accidents every day is just, but even though, we think that there are railway accidents, but actually, if you do the number of accidents, you just don't see the road accidents. It's just probably orders of magnitude bigger than that. So there is a huge cost to under-providing the railways. I think that, I mean, this is a fundamental challenge which has to be encountered. So the way forward that I think the railways, what they're planning to do, for example, on the congestion, 2 dedicated freight corridors are going to be built, one on the eastern side and one on the western side. And so essentially what will happen is that the congestion will be to some extent solved, because you'll have freight moving on a separate track compared to passenger, and that should help relieve the cost to a considerable extent. As I said, now we have an independent rail regulator who's going to, which is going to pronounce on fares, on how to bring in private sector, how to corporatize maybe, which ones are ready for corporatizations, which ones aren't, and to do many of these things. There's a Vivek Debroy committee which made some very important recommendations on, I mean, one of the key reforms that they recommended was, part of being this big public sector monopoly, part of being having been created, a long time ago, part of the whole, bureaucratic persistence and inertia that happens. I think that we don't have, proper financial accounting in the railways, and I think that one of the major recommendations, which I think the ministry is taking very seriously, is to kind of get into more, because we don't even have, if you don't have good accounting, you don't have a good sense of, losses, costs, which are the profit centers, which are the cost centers, what should you be focusing on, and so on. And of course, the minister has been emphasizing a lot, increasing the convenience for passengers, or how to make them cleaner, introducing wireless, introducing new trains. So a lot of things are going on in the railway sector, and of course we also in this latest budget we merged the union and the railway budget because we thought there would be there was no good reason why these should be separate. After all, defense is part of the central government budget, railways as well, and also it will then allow you to take a kind of broader perspective of how we should treat all sectors in a kind of consistent manner. So this is where we are on the railways. I think that in your classrooms, I think that there are also very interesting things going on in the telecom sector. I think, for example, I think that's something that you could also, there are interesting things going on in the road sector as well. And so many things you could do in your classroom. But here we just wanted to give you a sense of kind of 2 interesting and important sectors. Yeah. Yeah.
So in case of monopolies.
In case of monopolies.
In case of monopolies and public utilities, how do you calculate subsidies and justify them? How do you calculate subsidies in these cases?
No, you can calculate subsidies like we did. I mean, you could see, I mean, how much, at least you can calculate.
Justification of those calculations of subsidies. Because there are inefficiencies, there are other issues.
Yeah, I think that we have to, again, let me, say something I've said often here is that, look, all these calculations are going to be difficult. But there are ways of doing them. If you want to incorporate inefficiency, whatever, you can do that. But you can always begin by doing a relative simple calculation and then making it more and more complex depending upon what you want to include, depending upon how much data also you have. But I think in order to make broader points, I think you can begin certainly with kind of simpler calculations, which is what we do here.
You have mentioned that the 65% of the rail lines are over 100% utilized, but there are many lines in like Northeast and etc. where their lines are totally unutilized. Only 2-3 trains are going. So are that lines are only laid because of political compulsion or because to develop this area?
So that's a very good question. In fact, I wanted to say this because it's true that while there are some that are over congested, there are also some that are underutilized, and we find this both in the Northeast and in other parts like Jammu and Kashmir. And so what I failed to mention, a very good point, is that these are part of the social obligations, or broader. So for example, just as we think it's politically justifiable and justified to give cheap passenger fares, it's also a matter of national priority and national importance to ensure connectivity of the Northeast. There may be also strategic and military reasons for doing it. There could be all kinds of, if you wanted a railway thing to develop those parts to reduce insurgency and so on. So that is very much part of the social obligations that the railways undertakes, and in a way that can be justified, and that is justified on national, whatever grounds, strategic grounds, security grounds, other political grounds.
If we remove the political economy, and which is very impossible to do, yet as economists, if we remove the political economy question, sir, in a way, railways competes with road for freight and other things, as you just mentioned, sir. So a similar investment in roads, because whatever little I know, even the road coverage in India is not too good if you look at the international comparisons. Now, because road is private sector, and just to illustrate, I mean, at a micro level, just because GST has come in now, I mean, it's in the works, I know from personal experience that already loading of trucks has stopped. Only 2 states have done it, and yet the freight has gone up. So the competitive pressures are building in by just one simple step of GST coming in, right? So do we have a similar multiplier for roads? Isn't it possible, won't it be better if as an exercise, we could work out what something like Genome did on public transport? So some states have done really well on public transport because of the central's help. Similar thing on road, rather than historically hanging on to railways despite the social. If we remove the social concerns for a few minutes, is it not possible that a multiplier for roads and investment will be higher than this?
Basic question is a very good one. That you can't just calculate multipliers for one sector without doing a comparable exercise for other sectors. I think that's a very, very fair point. And I think we haven't done that, and I think we should do that. And I don't know what the answer would be. I frankly don't know what the answer would be, because it seems to me that obviously there could be benefits. We know, for example, from the Pradhan Mantri Gram Sadak Yojana that there were huge benefits from that as well. But remember that I do know about those studies. They don't take into account the kind of the externalities. So a proper analysis should be a kind of a comparative cost-benefit analysis, both taking into account the private benefits, private costs, and the social costs, and so. But I think maybe there have been transport sector committee reports like the Rakesh Mohan report, which may have some.
But MORTH does these exercises.
Yeah.
I mean, they outsource this.
Sorry, MOTS is
The Minister of
Transport.
Yeah.
See, but now the advantage of the railway budget being centralized is that we can do it in a more comparative.
They look into the direct effects, indirect effects, and the induced effect.
Okay.
All these 3 effects they look into.
Good. I think that we should look at those studies. Yeah. Yeah, please. Yeah.
So the question is regarding the price and fare of the railways. So we see that in the recent times the fares have been revised twice and thrice, and there is a drastic increase. And we say that the railway is for the poor and common man travels. It is a national priority. And you also mentioned that Delhi Calcutta fares 3,000 rupees and 3,500 by air. So that gap is becoming lesser and lesser.
Narrow,
so
exactly.
Is it good for Indian Railway? What is your take on that? I mean, at the same time, we want it to prioritize. It is for national priority, but the air part is gearing up. So, is it good for India?
I think that I think that we need to invest more in the railways. I think that's clear. But I think we also need more efficiencies, more corporateization in the railways. So, I mean, I cannot imagine, at least for the next 50 years, not having railways in our country. I mean, maybe at some stage we'll all have flying cars, and even though flying cars will be very cheap even for the poor, but for a long time. But I think that therefore the challenge going forward is how do we address this challenge, and part of it has to be with much more efficiency and corporatization, and not corporatization of different parts of the railways, not wholesale anything, but clearly, for example, railway stations, can be managed in certain way.
Flexible pricing would be
Dynamic pricing is another idea that's introducible. To some extent, is already there. So I think we can think of lots of things that we can do. But whether it'll address the fundamental challenge, it's an open question. Yeah. He has the mic, so.
Sir, the question related to that same subsidies and the fare which you have indicated, two of your slides, at least it contradict. Is it subsidy, or subsidy is a misnomer? It is an inefficient cost allocation from government. Because when you are charging to air conditioning, seats, more or less equivalent to airways, where 2 hours to 24 hours is, the timing, then giving this 115, the figure which you have indicated for 14-15 as a subsidy for air conditionings. So is it not an efficient operation which is going to get compensated by the government? Why we call it subsidy? Subsidy is mean to the consumer. I mean, consumer is unable to really pay, but you are charging consumer complete competitive price in the market. And even presently the dynamic price, recently I was checking, more than 5,000 rupees was there, Delhi, Calcutta. Second question is related to inefficiency itself, sir, related to dedicated freight corridor, which was there in 2007-8 starting with initial capital busting of 25,000 crore, which has moved to more than 1 lakh crore rupees, and yet not complete, and even some of the area land acquisition is still not there. So where the cost will head, we don't know. So these are the certain issues which railway had to get addressed. And last part, sir, the investment part, 8.5 lakh crore rupees has been the investment which has been set 2 years back. 1 lakh crore rupees was set by LIC. 3,000 crore rupees was put as an initial fund to start with. More than 8 months has passed, but hardly 1 rupee has been spent from there. So is it not a poor planning and implementation which has put the railway on the back foot? Thank you, sir.
I'll just answer the first question on the calculation of. The calculation of subsidy is just what is the railways themselves do. What is the cost of supplying each of these, and then you compare that with what you actually charge, and then you could say that like we do, you should say what is the cost that cost plus whatever average consumption tariff like GST, like 18% that we should charge on this, and that we compare with what they actually charge. So it's a very simple calculation. It's not a very difficult calculation to do. But on the other thing about what they should be doing and things, I think you should go and meet the railway people, I think, and then start an please.
Since this is, you expect these things to be delivered to the classroom. So I have a question there that how does Indian Railway compare with other major rail networks, like six mentioned US, China, and Russia? Because that would offer a better ground to reflect upon.
So in the chapter on the railways here, there are some cross-country comparisons on freight, on investment, on tariffs, and all these things. Yeah, you can.
How does railway fare with other large employers of the world? Like, say it's the 8th largest, so how does it fare with the 1st, 2nd, 3rd, and others? So, any ready reference for that, or say do you have?
No, I don't have a ready reference for that. But in terms of comparing it to other railways, the survey has it, and there are references there, and we should, So in this, my friend, we have a little bit of cross-country here. We showed you this. We also showed you this. So all these are cross-country comparisons, more in the chapter. You should go and read them, yeah?
See, you had mentioned the Debra committee and the accounting reforms. I'm also part of that reform process because they are converting cash to accrual.
Mm-hmm.
But don't you think there is a contradiction? Cash to accrual is a good, but there is a contradiction. On one side, we are merging rail budget with the union budget. And on the other side, we are promoting individual profit centers inside the railway. And In contrary to this, the entire rail budget was a profit center concept. We were taking rail as a separate thing, and we are merging it to the union budget. So inside we are trying to have a something like a more profit centers inside the railways, but railway as a whole, we don't want profit center cultures. So what's your view on this?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I think that, look, my own view here, and I'm not the expert on this, is that it's true. For example, it's true that in corporate accounting you have accrual systems, right? Whereas the government budget is all cash. Yeah. There has been some talk to move towards accrual, but that's not that's not on the agenda as yet. So my own sense is that at the moment, the railways is kind of operates like a kind of quasi-government. I think your point is very valid, is that as you start corporatizing this more and more, then there will be this tension between accounting systems as well. So at some stage, I think we may have to think about whatever you corporatize, maybe those budgets must be separated from the central budget. But it's true that the more you have private sector type activities in the railways, your accounting systems with the government then start coming into tension. It's a very good point.
The change there is, what do you do with the existing capacity and the costs that are involved in creating the capacity, and how do you assure returns, particularly to the private sector whom you had promised certain things when you brought them into partnership?
Yeah.
Now this is a very important question.
Yeah.
How much capacity should be created and at what cost? Because all technological changes cannot be preempted, and that is exactly the kind of problems that are there in where we should focus our attention. Even in manufacturing, you said we should move out from cotton to man-made fiber because the future is in that. But say the handloom industry, it has given employment, it is an already created capacity to be not putting in money there. So this is a very big issue, and in that context, what about nuclear energy? Because it is already only 2%, even if it moves into a little bit more, look at the kind of costs that are involved, both financial and social costs.
Yeah, so I think nuclear power raises, because of, with nuclear power, remember you have gestation lags that are maybe even longer than you have for thermal power. Also the whole question of waste, what do you do with nuclear waste? There's also the whole question of which was the object of considerable debate about the the kind of, what do you call this, what kind of insurance mechanisms should you have? What's the word for it? Liability issues, yeah. So I think it's a very complicated, but what you do see the world over now is, once again, you see, world over, remember what happened with nuclear power. We saw a huge thing, then we had some accidents, we had, for a long time. Then about 4, 5, 6 years ago, we thought there was going to be a revival of this. But now suddenly, both because of renewables and because also for other reasons, it seems once again that nuclear is becoming less attractive. For example, a recent thing is that Toshiba is a company in Japan which has basically wound down. It's gone bankrupt. And that was one of the major producers of the thing. But the country that does a lot of nuclear power, of course, France is one that has had, but China is actually still doing. But you see, but remember, nuclear power is also something that my hunch is that in democratic countries, the equation on nuclear power will be very different from in other countries, because there's also the whole environmental angle to it. But technologically, it seems that renewables are putting even nuclear power under immense stress. So all the things about long-term contracting, doing this, renegotiating, are going to be as complicated, if not more so, for the nuclear sector. Okay, thank you very much.